Say he so typifies the spirit of cooperation that people here in the Bay Area and indeed the people of California take it upon themselves to create this understanding which draws both of our countries together. Yet you need someone to put all this goodwill into a good perspective, a policy perspective. How do we kind of explain outside of just the normal goodwill intentions? Well, we have one person here who also works with the Bay Area Council. I've known this gentleman for maybe 20 years also. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Sean Randolph from the Bay Area Council here to talk about some policy ideas to help codify, so to speak, the relationship between China and the United States.
Well, thanks very much, James, and even maybe longer than 20 years. I don't want to count this now. But thanks also very much to Mrs. Fang for her vision in bringing us all together here today. This seems to be a good time to take stock of where we are exactly in U.S.-China relations and the relations between our companies here and companies in China, because we need to understand this if we're able to actually identify the way forward together to further build our relationship. So China and the Bay Area, as has been suggested earlier, have an extraordinary history. The first Chinese immigrants to the United States came through the Golden Gate in the 1850s. Ever since then, San Francisco and the Bay Area has hosted the largest Chinese community in the United States. And that community, as rich and vibrant and large as it is, has provided an important foundation on which we have both continued to build our relationship. And the Bay Area has really been unique in the United States in pioneering economic and other ties between the U.S. and China across a number of fronts, including the establishment of the San Francisco-Shanghai Sister City Committee, which was the first in the United States between a U.S. city and a Chinese city. China is clearly very much in our DNA here in the Bay Area, and we in the Bay Area probably have a greater stake in the future of strong U.S.-China relationships than any place else in the United States. So, as we all know, this year marks the 40th anniversary of diplomatic ties with the U.S., and since then the relationship has broadly developed in the direction of economic integration, anchored by critical reforms in China that have introduced very large elements of market economics into Chinese economy. Parts of the economy have been opened to foreign investment. Our companies have stepped into China through that door in a very big way. China's admission about 20 years ago to the World Trade Organization was a fundamental turning point in this relationship, which opened global markets to Chinese exports, especially to the U.S., and also set the stage for massive foreign investment in China, especially in manufacturing, much of that by American companies. At the same time, we saw the interaction between people growing in fundamental ways that continue and have deepened to this day. Large numbers of students were sent to universities around the world, but especially to universities in the United States. Many were studying at the graduate level in important fields. Many came and are continuing to come to our leading universities, including Stanford and Berkeley. And most recently, and really importantly for our economy here, as China's foreign exchange reserves, as its companies became larger, they became global, China became a major exporter of capital around the world. In the past, it was really capital coming from the U.S. and elsewhere into China. Such a critical change. China became an exporter of capital. It began acquiring companies, investing in companies around the world, but especially here in the Bay Area, especially here in California. The three leading destinations for Chinese investment in the United States have been New York, Los Angeles, and the San Francisco Bay Area. And today we find a wide range of companies from China, Chinese-sponsored accelerators, Chinese venture capital, and other investment funds located right here in the Bay Area, as Senator Legal was saying, very close to where we're meeting today. And another thing that really links us in a unique way here in the Bay Area with China is innovation. As we all know, the Bay Area is all about innovation. It's the innovation epicenter, the entrepreneurial, the technology epicenter of the world. And that draws partners and companies from around the world. But when we look at what's happening in China, innovation is happening in China as well in really important ways. China is generating more and more patents that are also being patented internationally, not just in China, which means that's a test of the quality. Whether you think this is going to be a global product, you patent it globally. Another test of innovation, scientific articles, things that are published in major scientific journals by scholars and others, by researchers from universities and elsewhere. The number of those articles has been growing enormously from China, but also the number of those articles that is being cited in other scientific publications, which is another test of quality. Are other scientists citing your work? That's growing enormously. On the business side, mobile commerce in China has exploded. It's far ahead of where we are in the US. The number of people who buy things on their mobile phones, those technologies reflect enormous innovation in market development and how to reach customers well ahead of what we're doing here. And behind that is entrepreneurs. We're seeing an explosion of entrepreneurial activity across China. Hungry, hardworking, driven entrepreneurs who are starting and founding companies. And one reflection of that is right now, China has the second largest number of unicorn companies, valued at $1 billion or more in the world, only after the United States. And by far the largest number of unicorn companies in all of Asia. So we are drawing closer around technology. We look at the Chinese companies that are here. Again, the investment firms, the venture firms, the technology firms, almost all the major Chinese automotive companies are here in the Valley, and many of our companies are in China. So there are so many things that connect us, and they have grown enormously over these last 40 years. Supported by all these developments, both abroad and in China, very importantly, China has emerged over this 40 years as the second largest economy in the world, and until this year was the largest trading partner for the United States. So this is all really positive development, and I think we have to say this is the foundation that we're looking to build on. But despite this growing web of connections, the U.S.-China relationship today is really at a crossroads, where further deepening of economic ties cannot be assumed, and potentially could even be reversed. The reasons for this lie as much in politics as in economics, where past assumptions about China's political and their economic trajectory are being challenged now, and policy issues that have long existed below the surface and have been managed in U.S.-China relations have risen to the surface in ways that are bringing the two governments more into open conflict and can't be ignored anymore. And the power lies in both governments to resolve these issues, to address them and to set a new foundation. So that's the challenge, but that's at the governmental level. As this goes on, and a lot of us thought we would see these conflicts resolved a year ago, unfortunately we're not seeing the end in sight yet. Whether or not that occurs, businesses on both sides are going to need to manage this new, much more uncertain and increasingly complex environment. And the choices that they make with the governments will frame how U.S.-China economic ties evolve over the next 40 years. So where are we right now? What are the realities that we, especially in the business community, are dealing with in U.S.-China relations? And we are really at a pivotal point, I think, between the past and the future. And the story changes if you read the media every day. Well, I think while much of the first 40 years of the relationship has been characterized by growth and by optimism. Today we're in new and quite uncharted territory. The issues being debated aren't new. They've been there a long time, but they are growing in intensity, and they're also more and more interconnected. And the fact that they're interconnected makes them harder than you would think otherwise to resolve. They're even more challenging. And the question again is, how do businesses that want to go forward and build ties together navigate this landscape? So several factors are at work, I think, that have brought us to this exact moment. And one, I mentioned the political side, is on basically more aggressively political and nationalistic leadership in both the United States and China. In the US, since coming into office in 2017, President Trump has aggressively pursued trade deficit reduction with a range of global partners, and in that China is not unique. It's joined the list as the administration has targeted US allies such as Mexico, Canada, Europe, and South Korea. So this is really a global push by the US administration, but China is still different though, because of its size, the scale of the US trade deficit with China, and the leading role the government plays in China's economy. Again, China is a special case. So that's the US side. In China, President Xi has centralized political power, reasserted the central role of the Communist Party in both government and also society and the economy, and is flexing China's muscle more visibly externally. And I think some of the policies that have been quite openly written about in China about ambitions or goals of dominating key technologies across a very broad range have become more explicit. And for the US, all of that has converged into a set of issues that go beyond the economic into national security concerns, mostly related to technology. And so we've seen, not just on the US side, but on the Chinese side, several converging trends that, given the scale of the economy, have just made it very difficult for the US to ignore. So when US-China ties really got going 40 years ago, there was a belief by many in the US and the West that the economies would converge, that while political structural systems would be different, that in fact, over time, China would become progressively more market-oriented to the point where the economies would never be identical, but there would be a large degree of market-based convergence. And I think that's another one of these questions that's being raised today. It's being called into question. Is China still on that path that people hoped and expected it would be on 40, 30, and 20 years ago? If we look at a couple of the issues that now are actually central to the debate at the moment. So we can drop them into three categories. There's trade, investment, and let's say the student. Excessive tariffs have been imposed on initially $250 billion worth of imports from China in the range of 10 to 25%. Another $300 billion likely to be imposed by the end of the year, and as we just learned yesterday, the possibility that tariffs of 25% go up to 30 and tariffs of 10% go up to 15%, essentially covering all imports from China to higher tariff levels. I think what hasn't quite gotten as much attention is investment, and we were hearing earlier how much investment has come into the Bay Area. So in August of last year, the Congress passed something called the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, or FIRMA for short, which expanded the authority of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, called CFIUS, a lot of government acronyms, which is an interagency body that reviews inbound foreign investment from any country for possible national security concerns. So in the past, the transactions that CFIUS looked at were really only large transactions where the overseas entity was acquiring a company or purchasing a majority or controlling share. With the new authority given to CFIUS, it can now review minority transactions that don't give control, and it can review smaller transactions, not just the very large ones. Ones that would potentially give an acquirer, say through a board of directors seat or minority stake, access to that company's technology. So investment in 27 different technologies now has to be reported to CFIUS. And I think this has greatly impacted the kind of investment that is now coming into the US and especially the Bay Area. And while CFIUS covers all countries, the reality is it's really focused on China these days. 50% of the transactions that are filed with CFIUS are by Chinese investors, but 100% of the investments that have been blocked by CFIUS are Chinese investments. The other category, which is really important to us here in the Bay Area, is students and scientific exchange. We were one of the major scientific and intellectual hubs of the United States, and this is a global and international conversation. So Chinese students and research personnel in a wide range of sensitive fields now are subject to increased scrutiny if they're going to come to our universities based on national security grounds. So June of the last year, the State Department, and this isn't in law, it's a regulatory process, announced it would start to limit visa validity for Chinese national students, especially graduate students. Remember, so many are graduate in the technology fields in STEM, and that they would increase the number of cases that are subject to multi-agency review. So Chinese students coming here in fields such as robotics, aviation, high-tech manufacturing, things of that nature, are now subject to 1-year renewable visas. In the past, they used to be 5-year renewable visas, and now it's down to only 1 year. And also Chinese nationals who are applying for a US visa need to obtain special permission if they want to work in research or management positions in any institutions that could be considered threatening to the US. So the effect of this is that Chinese looking to come here to our universities and research institutions are looking at longer waiting periods as they're reviewed. Sometimes those waiting periods are so long that they actually kill the trip because they just can't wait for the review to go through. And I know of personal cases, people who have worked in non-security fields on energy efficiency with Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, who were unable to come because they couldn't get a visa, even though they'd been working with the university for 15 years. So this is what we're seeing. And also, federal government agencies are now engaged with our universities here in the Bay Area and around the country in conversations about how do you manage and the necessity of having greater control, greater scrutiny on who is studying at your university in your programs, with the idea that access will be more limited than it was in the past. And universities are all struggling with how to manage this right now. This is really important for us here in the Bay Area where we have so many foreign students, including so many from China. China is currently the largest source of foreign students in the US, about 350,000 or so, especially postgraduates. And they're a very large presence and contributors here at our universities. So what's the impact of this? How is it showing up in the bottom line right now? One, in trade, we know that both economies are being affected, no doubt about that. Slower growth, shade maybe about 0.5% so far off of US GDP. Products that incorporate Chinese inputs that are manufactured in the US are becoming more expensive. And the funny thing, the administration wants to promote US manufacturing, that we all, I think, want to promote, but very often those products manufactured in the US are made incorporating a lot of intermediate Chinese goods, Chinese components. If they can't get those, if those costs go up 10, 15, 25, 30%, their profit margins are down, they can't expand, they can't hire in the way they would like to. So it's rather ironic you have this inverse effect on manufacturing for policies that are designed to actually encourage manufacturing. Agriculture, we're the largest agricultural exporting state of the United States here in California. Right now, the federal government is spending about $20 billion to compensate American farmers for lost exports, primarily to China. And China's announced it's not going to buy any more agricultural exports, and so those costs could go up. So this gets reflected in your pocketbooks and ours. Pretty much everybody, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York estimates that the U.S. tariffs that are already in place cost every U.S. household about $830, and that if the new tariffs go in, and this is at the old level, not the higher level, it would be something over $1,000 per household in cost. So this is real, and becoming more real as the tariffs are applied not just to industrial goods, but also to consumer goods. So reflecting that, China in this last quarter of 2019 dropped from being America's #1 trading partner to #2, behind Mexico. In the first half of this year, our exports to China, our imports from China, fell 12%. Our exports to China fell 19% after years of growth on both sides. This is really a remarkable reversal. On the investment side, we're seeing impacts in bilateral trade flows, especially to the U.S. from Chinese investment that is inbound. Chinese inbound investment coming to the U.S. fell to $5.4 billion in 2018. It was $46.5 billion in 2016. So this is real. In California, Chinese investment has dropped from $16.4 billion in 2016 to a little over $300 billion last year. So not all of this is political. Part of that is the Chinese government's policies to control the outflow of capital, which was really growing very quickly, and to discourage risky investment by large Chinese companies that were maybe getting a bit ahead of themselves. So a lot of that is just policies by the government to control capital going out the door. But we do know, notwithstanding that a lot of the newest slowdown is because of concerns about the review of inbound investment from China at the national level, which discourages companies who don't want uncertainty. You know, if you don't know the investment environment you're going into, if you don't know how long it's going to take, if your investment will be approved, a lot of people just don't want to try it. And finally, I think when we, well, those are the big, I think the big three categories of activities. When we look at the way forward, or actually I should say, I forgot to mention the impact on students. So there is a growing perception in China among students that the US is a less receptive, a less friendly place than it was in the past. As I mentioned earlier, many Chinese students coming here are subject to longer waiting times to get their visas. Universities are scrambling with how to deal with these issues, and now the Confucius Institutes are subject to more pressure. San Francisco State just had to close its Confucius Institute, so we're seeing it not just in the students, but in those kinds of programs. So what's the way forward? What might happen next, and what are we actually, what could we do? So very briefly in the area of trade, until there's a negotiated solution, we are definitely looking at higher tariffs, higher consumer costs. A lot of American companies, including US companies, California companies, are, they're not leaving China, but they're shifting some of their manufacturing and products that would be subject to US tariffs out of China, especially to Vietnam, maybe to Mexico, impacting global supply chains. On the investment side, I think it's important to say that the door to Chinese investment in the US and the Bay Area is not closed. Investors are finding ways forward to work with the new rules, and these US national security issues that have been raised are not categorical and not incompatible with Chinese acquisitions. More than half the Chinese applications for investments are still being approved. So that door is not closed. But it does take time, it does take patience for the applicants to actually go through that process. Some will be discouraged, but they should not be so discouraged to think that the door is not open to this kind of very important investments, especially when they're ready to completely and carefully prepare their case. And it should also be noted that CFIUS is continuing to include or to clear really large deals, even when there may be some concerns if they can find ways to segregate access by the investor to certain kinds of technologies. And CFIUS does not look at joint ventures outside of the U.S. between U.S. and Chinese companies. So there's a lot of open doors there. And on the student side, we're finding the number of students is being maintained. Although there are a lot of concerns out there through 2018, we found a very strong flow of Chinese students coming here. Our universities are continuing to welcome and accommodate them despite some of the issues, and that's extremely important. So the bottom line about how we grow together now. So after 40 years of growing closer, deepening exchanges, cooperation is at a risk of going in reverse. Because of the depth of the connection between the Bay Area and China, we have more at stake than anywhere in the U.S. in seeing momentum maintained and going forward. We have the ability in both of our governments to resolve these problems with the will to do so. 40 years of cooperation is an achievement we should recognize and protect and build on. There is so much common ground. There is so much still to be achieved between the U.S. and Mexico, but dialogue, or Mexico, the U.S. and China, but dialogue is essential, honest dialogue, if we want to maintain that kind of forward momentum. There's an important role here, a critical role to be played by cities and by states at the subnational level as the national issues are being resolved. As you heard earlier from Jim Wonderman, the Bay Area Council is committed to this path. Overwhelmingly, these places, companies, cities, states, want to see the relationship grow and are investing in it. And we, in the Bay Area and California, our partners in China and the world will benefit if the U.S. and China continue to grow together and not apart. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sean,
for fundamental interests and benefit our two peoples significantly. Thank you very much.